once you keep making arguments that the system is evil, the system is the problem, there will be people who say, well, if the system is evil and the system is the problem, and then elections are a fraud, doesn't make Republicans, Democrats, doesn't make the slightest bit of difference. If you're going to get rid of the system and you can't do it by elections, then you have to do it through revolution.
On April 13th, 2025, an arsonist set fire to the residence of the governor of Pennsylvania. When apprehended, the criminal told law enforcement officers that he used Molotov cocktails to set the fire. This took place just hours after the governor, an American Jew, and his Jewish family had concluded their Passover Seder. The next month, an activist for Palestine murdered 2 members of the Israeli embassy staff, having gone to a Jewish venue, hosting a Jewish event, in order to hunt down and kill Jewish people. Not long after that, on May 28th, a Michigan man was apprehended outside of a Jewish preschool after threatening Jewish parents and children. It was later discovered that he had attempted to acquire firearms and had planned to kill members of the school. The most recent news: on June 1st, an Egyptian national attended a solidarity walk in Boulder, Colorado, for hostages that remain in Gaza. There, he threw Molotov cocktails and used a homemade flamethrower in order to burn supporters of the Israeli hostages. While hurling the explosives, he was recorded yelling "Free Palestine" and other like phrases. A new season of violence has descended upon the Jews of America. Or perhaps one ought to say that a new season of violence has descended upon America, with the Jews being at the center of the target, revealing for all to see the state of domestic terrorism. Welcome to the Tikvah podcast. I'm your host, Jonathan Silver. My guest this week is Jeffrey Herf, professor emeritus at the University of Maryland, an historian and analyst of anti-Semitism. It is his contention that the spike in domestic terrorism in America has an antecedent in the 1960s radical movements that, back then, like now, served as the infrastructure that transformed leftist ideas into violent action. The language of globalizing the Intifada has been a hallmark of campus and leftist protest since October 7th, but it has slipped the bounds of speech and resulted in violence, including deadly violence. Inspired by the writer Paul Berman, Herf argues that if history is any guide, violence against Jews is likely to increase now. He lays this all out in an article he published just hours after the Boulder attack. Free Palestine Terrorism was published in the Free Press on June 1st, 2025. If you enjoyed this conversation, you can subscribe to the Tikvah podcast on Apple Podcasts, Google Play, and Spotify. I hope you'll leave us a 5-star review to help us grow this community of ideas. I welcome your feedback on this or any of our other podcast episodes at podcast@tikvah.org. And of course, if you want to learn more about our work at Tikvah, you can visit our website, tikvah.org, and follow us on Facebook and Twitter. Here now is my conversation with Jeffrey Herf. Jeffrey Herf, welcome to the Tikvah podcast.
Thank you for having me. It's a pleasure to be here.
Our ambition for this conversation, Jeffrey, is to talk about the meaning that connects the horrible assassination of those 2 Israeli embassy employees in Washington, combined with this domestic terrorist activity that took place in Boulder, Colorado, just days ago. As you came to begin to interpret the meaning of both of those things, you were reminded of a passage from a book that was written back in 2003 by the writer-analyst Paul Berman, Terror and Liberalism. What made you think of that book, and what was the argument that you were recovering then?
Well, Paul is an old and dear friend and a marvelous writer. And he lives in Brooklyn. And I don't think this is apocryphal. I think he actually, from his apartment, saw the Twin Towers fall. And he then decided to examine the ideological history of Al-Qaeda. And the result was this, I think, classic work called Terror and Liberalism, which is, I think, as important for understanding terrorism in American intellectual life as Albert Camus' The Rebel was in France. And Paul observed that after the attack, of 9/11, uh, terrorism around the world increased. Um, and he looked at another example of the Second Intifada in Israel. The Second Intifada was Ehud Barak, the Israeli prime minister, made an offer to Yasser Arafat of a Palestinian state on the West Bank with half of Jerusalem as the capital and Gaza. And Arafat turned it down. And not only did he turn it down, he could have turned it down and said, "No, I want more. Let's keep negotiating." But then he launched this terrorist campaign called the Second Intifada, which included, which I think led to over 1,000 Israeli deaths, and uh, there were horrible bombs placed on buses, and just
Yeah, the
complete.
key to understand about the Second Intifada is that it purposefully did not target military sites or law
Yes,
enforcement. It was designed to terrorize Israeli civilians.
right. And so Berman's insight was that the more terrorism there was, the more antagonism to Israel spread around Europe and the United States. Uh, Now, that's not, of course, there were many people who were appalled, the governments were appalled by the terrorism, but his focus was on the intellectual world, and the intellectual world was divided. But nevertheless, there were people who responded to the terrorism with uh, in two ways. One, those who thought of themselves as revolutionaries or radical leftists saw these things as a great blow in the global revolution, and but there was probably a minority, and then there was a larger group that said, well, if these people are blowing themselves up in suicide attacks, Israel must have done something very, very terrible to have led them to do that. Um, and uh, and that insight about the increase of anti-Semitism in the aftermath of terrorist attacks that Paul examined in 2003 was something that Paul and I stay in touch. Something that we both have been thinking about since October 7th.
So I want to just enter into the psychology of what the meaning could possibly be that violent anti-Semitic attacks would increase and accelerate rather than decrease and be restrained by the example of the Second Intifada. So you might think, looking at that, that there are children coming home from school on buses and a suicide bomber steps onto the bus and explodes the bus. And here you have horribly a dozen martyrs a dozen casualties. Um, and the reaction to that is not moral repugnance, but something else. It somehow authorizes more activity of the same kind. What's actually happening there?
A linguistic magic, a linguistic magic that developed over the last 50 years. Um, the people who carried out those suicide bombings were members of Hamas in 2000. And Hamas, as perhaps the viewers of this podcast are aware, issued a charter in 1988, which declared basically a war of religion to destroy the state of Israel. And the it's a reactionary document. Blames the Jews for the French Revolution and the Russian Revolution and World War II. It is a document very much in the tradition of the extreme right in Europe and around the world. The linguistic magic is that this reactionary organization, which suppresses women and gays and is, virulently, I mean, there's no question about its Jew hatred. It's proud of its hatred of Judaism and Jews, and therefore of Israel. It doesn't mince any words about that. So why did the global left then rally to the cause or repeat the propaganda of this reactionary organization? And the after the Second Intifada or after October 7th, uh, or during the wars Hamas launched after 2007 from Gaza. And the reason is that in the secular world that I live in, or we live in the universities, in the press, in the United States, and in Europe, since the early 50s as regard the Soviet Union, and then since the 60s regarding the global radical left, uh, Israel was denounced as part of the global imperialist system. And therefore, anybody who fights against the imperialist monster must be part of the revolution. And so the linguistic magic is the transformation of a reactionary organization such as Hamas into a cause célèbre of the global left. Uh, the So rather than uh, react with revulsion to these attacks, uh, the classic revolutionary radical argument is that there is no other opportunity, therefore people are driven to desperate measures, and it's
Hmm.
all in the interest of bringing about a just and a just outcome in um, what they call Palestine. So,
See,
uh,
I want to, I don't, I want to question that and press it, not because I think that ultimately the conclusion is incompatible with what I'm about to propose,
yeah,
I've detected something else, and
yes.
I want to advance this other hypothesis, which is that on the surface, the rhetorical self-presentation of the left is peace-loving and peace-seeking. It is opposed to war and those rapacious empires and colonists like America and Israel and so on. But underneath the surface, there is a hunger for blood. There is a bloodlust, and there is a hunger for violence. And one sees that at the slightest provocation, very quick to go to this. There's no other recourse available to us other than violence and intimidation and terrorism. It's too fast to escalate to that in a way that leads me to question whether um, the means are not the thing that they seek. Um, the means are not the thing that they seek altogether.
Well, that makes sense. The In my article, I talked about in my essay in the Free Press on free Palestine terrorism. I spoke about the 1960s and
No, I want
Weatherman.
to come to that. Yeah, yes. That's a
So,
very
so,
important part of
so,
this conversation.
yeah. So this might be a way of addressing your question. Your question, the hypothesis you present is a plausible one, and that is, uh, if, like me, you were a freshman in college in 1965, and then you joined the Students for Democratic Society, and you were part of something called the anti-war movement,
Hmm.
and the anti-war movement was arguing that the war in Vietnam was a mistake. The more conservative members of the anti-war movement would say it's a strategic blunder. Uh, American national interests are elsewhere. And
Hmm.
then other people said we're using napalm and killing children and it's immoral and whatever. And so the broad anti-war movement was get out of Vietnam. We want peace and love. We don't want war. But the so let's call them left liberals, right? Let's call the anti-war movement a left liberal movement. But within the anti-war movement, there was something else, which was the radical left. And the radical left had concluded that the war in Vietnam was the product of a system called imperialism or capitalism, that it was not a mistake or a blunder. It was the logical outcome of the nature of American capitalism. And therefore, like Lenin in World War I, the response of the radical left was revolution, not peace. And as for that wing of the movement, the anti-war movement was a bunch of sissies, wimps, non. They wouldn't face the realities, and the uh, so that is so then. Of course, there are leftists who are in favor of socialism who are not in favor of political violence. but once you keep making arguments that the system is evil, the system is the problem, there will be people who say, well, if the system is evil and the system is the problem, and then elections are a fraud. It doesn't make Republicans, Democrats, doesn't make the slightest bit of difference. If you're going to get rid of the system and you can't do it by elections, then you have to do it through revolution.
Mm-hmm.
And the and that was what gave rise to this radical leftist organization, the Weather Underground, which engaged for a while in some bombings and then faded out. And the so
I actually like.
and it's not. I don't think when I think back on those years, I don't recall bloodlust. In other words, I don't recall any movement attracts lunatics. Any mass movement, there will be crazy people that are interested in running around in the street or throwing bricks at policemen, or so that and it may attract even sadists and people who enjoy violence. Uh, but more importantly was the ideological dimension that we are building a great, beautiful new world. And the only way that this new world can be brought into existence is through some apocalyptic revolutionary deed. Um, and that's evident in you don't need a weatherman to know which way the wind blows, the June 1969 statement, and then weather statements of fall of 1969. And the again, the audience may not be familiar with this, but the in December of 1969, members of the Weather Underground were building bombs in a townhouse in Manhattan on 11th Street, and they blew themselves up. Not intentionally, it was an error. But what historians and the police determined was that the purpose of the bomb was to be exploded at a dance at Fort Dix, where there would be hundreds of soldiers and their girlfriends. So American history would look very different if that bomb had gone off in Fort Dix.
Mm-hmm.
Uh, but when the weather people blew themselves up, then the there were more bombings and all that. But as a major terrorist organization, Weatherman faded out. Um, and the contrast here with Japan and Germany, Italy is very important. The post-Nazi, post-fascist, post-imperial societies, because in each of those three societies, the left that emerged from the 1960s really did become a terror. They really did produce terrorist organizations and engaged in political murder,
Mm-hmm.
that assassinated political leaders, that was not putting bombs in a toilet in the Pentagon at 3 in the morning, as weather people did, I think, on one occasion. I have to correct. I may have, maybe, I think that's the case. But in Italy and Germany and Japan, there were terrorist organizations that really were determined to murder leading business, corporate executives, government officials, that kind of thing.
Mm-hmm.
And that went on into the 1980s. So nothing like that. There was the Brinks bank robbery in 1982, I think. Was it 82, 81, 83, around then? Um, and there was several policemen were killed, but my point is this, that Weatherman was surrounded by a climate of antagonism to terrorism, whether it was the Grateful Dead or Bob Dylan or Johnny Cash or Linda Ronstadt, or the whole music of the period was about peace and love. Yeah. And then there was a
And at the
left.
level of ideas, at the level of ideas too, you describe that the new left in America was certainly leftist, but was arrayed itself in opposition to this kind of revolutionary terrorism.
Yes. I mean, here, if take Herbert Marcuse's One-Dimensional Man, one of the most famous books of the 1960s. Um, the um, uh, the analysis of that book is that the American working class is no longer an agent of revolution because it's too interested in buying things, and it has false consciousness, and therefore the only way things will change is if there's a small elite that connects with black radicalism in the third world and overthrows the system. That was one way of interpreting it, but that was a minority way. That was one of the pleasures of revolutionary radicalism, is that it takes that leap from what, well, here's the analysis, this is the logical implication. The only reason for not adopting the logical implication is cowardice. So if you want to be brave and macho, then you should become a revolutionary. Most people didn't accept that. They thought that this was crazy, and uh, and the faculty of the universities of the 1960s was predominantly liberal, and by liberal I mean really liberal, not leftist.
Hmm.
Fans of the New Deal. There were some conservatives, but and a few Marxists here and there, the but the faculty overwhelmingly was not offering messages about the evils of American imperialism and the need for revolution. Uh, the faculty was much less leftist than it became over the subsequent 40 years, 50 years. So uh, in order, it's one thing for somebody to make that leap from radical analysis to terrorist deed. And in Germany and Japan and in Italy, there were a lot of other people who weren't making that leap, but nevertheless would denounce the previous generation of Nazis or fascists or Japanese
Hmm.
imperialists, what have you. Um, there wasn't the same climate of support for terrorism in the United States. There just wasn't.
Nevertheless, the case of the weathermen and the case of the assailant and murderer of the two Israeli embassy employees both emerge out of the university ecosystem and are somehow cultivated and nurtured by that ecosystem. Somehow the free play of ideas and the ambient ideological currents that form that place seem to produce this.
Weatherman was led by graduates of Columbia, University of Chicago, University of Michigan, some people from Harvard, some from Case Western Reserve, I think, maybe. I'm not sure about that. Um, but it was very much a result, a product of the most elite universities, a minority of people at the most elite universities. I should stress that. Um, uh, who who thought that after all, revolutionaries like Lenin or Mao Zedong or Castro think of themselves as an elite, the vanguard of humanity. The
Hmm.
rest of humanity is cowardly or terrified. They are willing to risk their lives in the service of this very complicated theory about international imperialism and global revolution. And so the uh, that was there in those days. But the point about the recent years is that overwhelmingly the faculty in our universities rejects terrorism. Um, that's true, but what exists in recent years that did not exist in those earlier years was a tenured faculty that keeps making the case that Israel is a settler colonial racist aggressive uh, uh, entity, quote unquote, uh, which was born in sin and continues in injustice. And the Palestinians are innocent victims, have no responsibility for this conflict. And the more that argument gets made by professors the more young people, their students, might conclude, well, I don't approve of what happened on October 7th. I may not be clear about exactly what happened, but I can, quote, I can understand it. And so the point of the essay is that the climate surrounding violence that produced an Ilias Rodriguez in Chicago, where he went to school, uh, that climate is more widespread. There's more of an ideological antagonism to Israel that has gained respectability in the academy, in parts of the press. Um, uh, there are not professors who are telling their students go out and kill somebody or blow something up. No, that's not happening. I mean, maybe there. Who knows? I mean, I don't. There are thousands of professors, but the ideological climate of anti-Zionism is
Mhm.
embedded. Isn't it's tenured?
And not only the
Am I answering your question? I mean, you want to go back and pose your hypothesis again? I want to make sure that I addressed it.
well, I think one has to observe that it's not only the authority and the complicity of faculty members, but also the scale and extent of anti-Zionist presence on campus. You note in your free press essay that the Students for Justice in Palestine has grown from a single chapter in Berkeley to
Yeah,
now close to 300 chapters
right,
as of
right.
2024. Um, each one of those chapters, I don't know, I can't say every single one of them, but by and large and for the most part, campus chapters have some kind of faculty sponsor, advisor, some kind of faculty person. And these chapters are not shy or bashful about advocating violence in their many chants and public statements.
Well, there are now the latest figures are there are 120 faculty for justice in Palestine chapters in American universities. Um, so the uh, I would agree with you that to chant "Free Palestine from the river to the sea" is not about peace and justice. It's a war cry. It's an appeal for war against Israel. And the students can't have it both ways. If you're so smart that you got into Harvard, or any other reasonably selective private or public university, then you have to understand you're not a child anymore. You're not an adolescent. Um, if you make that kind of a chant, what you're calling for is war. And are you or are you not in favor of Hamas winning this war? Yes or no? Um, because that is what that chant is about. Um, it I I recently read the 7 October Parliamentary Commission report written by a team led by House of Lords member Andrew Roberts, who's
Hmm.
also a very well-known author. And I would urge everyone who's listening to this or viewing this podcast to read the report. It's online, the 7 October Parliamentary Commission report. It's overwhelming. Uh, I'm a historian of modern German history, and I have spent decades uh, studying and reading about the Holocaust, and the murder of the Jews. And one of the things that the Nazis were determined to do was to keep it secret as much as possible. No details. They were quite blunt in public, that they were so proud of exterminating the Jews, but no details. And the Einsatzgruppen and the special murder squads certainly did everything they could to obscure the reality of what they were doing from prying eyes. One of the most astonishing things about the Roberts report is that not only Hamas, but also members of the Popular Front for the Liberation of Palestine and other groups on October 7th and 8th actually filmed their own criminal deeds and put them on the internet. That is unprecedented in modern history. I know of no other example in which criminals actually were proud of displaying such barbarism. And this was reported at the time in the New York Times, the Washington Post, the Wall Street Journal, on NBC, CBS, ABC, PBS. This was not this was reported in October and November of 2023.
Hmm.
And as I read the Roberts report, my revulsion and disgust for these young people who chanted "Free Palestine from the river to the sea" grew and grew and grew. Because we had people at many of our universities who were celebrating a bunch of criminals. And as if that had something to do with peace and justice or making a better world. And what they were saying was that they did not care that some member of the elite Nukba unit murdered a whole family up close in their own living room with an assault rifle. And I won't go, I mean, the Roberts report is full of many, many such barbaric acts. I'm not going to go into details. But where was the empathy? Where was the empathy? And
Well, Jeffrey, I want to just draw out and observe back to you what I take to be a fascinating set of cultural and psychological assumptions that underlies both the Nazi aversion to broadcasting the details of its crimes
mhm,
and the Hamasnik incentive to do the same, because it gets back to the Paul Berman insight that I find so troubling, that is the animating thesis of this
yeah,
kind of analysis. The Nazi psychological assumption, cultural assumption would be that if we were to display in granular detail the depravity and barbaric lengths to which we are going in order to wipe the Jews from history, then Germans will be grossed out by that. They won't support us anymore. Whereas I think the Hamas instinct is something else. If we show that we're the courageous ones who are actually willing to not speak but act out the vanguard, what the vanguard requires for this revolution, this anti-Western, anti-colonialist revolution, we won't gross them out. We will inspire them to follow in our wake. We'll find supporters amongst them. And lo and behold, that's in fact what they found.
I think that's right. The uh, After decades of propaganda which describe Israelis as inhuman, brutal, uh, perpetrators of injustice, the bottom line is they got what they deserved
The
for the,
Israelis. Yeah.
yeah, yeah, um, and that accounted for the lack of empathy. Uh, there were many statements in October and November uh, bemoaning or decrying the violence of October 7th in a sentence or two or three. And then there would be a longer article about, but this must be placed against the historical context of 70 years of oppression of the Palestinians, as if Martin Luther King had never existed.
Mhm.
You know, as if the American Civil Rights Movement, with the most successful reform movement in modern history, had never taken place. Because Martin Luther King was an enormous political success. John Lewis these are hugely successful political leaders. And
Mhm.
what did these other people accomplish other than destruction and violence and death? Nothing. So the the uh, it's uh, it's a very sobering moment, and to think back on all that, the we're not discussing the conduct of the war in Gaza, and I would assume that you, like me, have friends in Israel. I have friends in Israel who served in the IDF, whose children are in the IDF, who are deeply opposed to the Netanyahu government, who wish there was a grand coalition. There are very, very uh, serious people who want this war to an end, and so there these debates in Israel, as we both know, go on. They're very lively, um, and the and people in this country, should be aware of them. But I'll remember that fall of 2023 for a long time, when some of my colleagues who were historians of the Holocaust
Hmm.
rushed into print in the New York Review of Books and elsewhere, claiming that it was Israel that was committing genocide.
Right, right.
Uh,
So there you do have you have the element of the university's complicity in this moral inversion on display. But now I want to bring together. We've
I
been
would say
speaking.
part of the faculty. I think
Yeah,
the
I don't want to castigate the entire universe. That's not fair. Obviously, that's
yeah
not fair.
yeah
But there is something undeniable about the fact that the more elite the campus is, that there tends to be more homogeneity in these anti-American, anti-civilizational countenance for those views. Not in
yeah
every case, but there seems to be a trend which is extremely worrying. Okay, that's on the one hand. But now I want to bring this to the Boulder assailant. This is
yeah
a person who doesn't come from the university system at all, from a completely different set of cultural formation, formed by an entirely different set of cultural resources, cultural experiences, political circumstances, and so on. This kind of Islamist anti-Semitism would seem at this moment to be joining forces with the anti-Western leftist anti-Semitism. And I wonder if you see if you see that the same way, if you see a difference.
Well, Mohammed Sabri, from I know is what I read in the press, is from Egypt. Um, who knows what his ideological views are? I mean, well, they're pretty clear in terms of Israel, um, but he the Sabri issue is issue of enforcing our immigration laws, and he overstayed his visa and he should have been deported long ago. Uh, the uh, I concluded the article by saying the criticism of terrorism must become louder, much, much louder. And uh, one thing that is done more effectively in France and Germany than in the United States is to make a distinction between Islam and Islamism.
Hmm.
And for too many years, people have been intimidated by the accusation of Islamophobia, that if you speak frankly about Hamas or about terrorism in the way that we have been doing here, that people will say, well, this is insulting to Islam, which is ridiculous. Um, uh, uh, there, the Sabri case is, he sounds, from what I've read, like somebody who uh, repeats the anti-Zionist arguments of the Muslim Brotherhood, but we'll just have to see. We'll certainly learn more about him.
Hmm.
Uh, the um, the I'm a historian of Germany, so I follow things there. The the Office for the Protection of the Constitution, their counterpart to the FBI, uh, makes distinctions between Islamist organizations and Muslims in general, and the uh, it's uh, the Sabri case just seems like uh, one of those cases where those distinctions were not made, perhaps out of fear and nervousness of being accused of Islamophobia,
Hmm.
uh, and the concept of Islamophobia needs to be subjected to more criticism. Pascal Bruckner in France, viewers of this podcast may want to look at his book, An Imaginary Racism, which is a very fine criticism. And there's a German historian and Arabist I want to bring to the attention of listeners. The young man named Bassem Tibi came to Frankfurt Main. He was born in Damascus and was part of a 60s leftist generation, came to Frankfurt, to Germany, to study social and critical theory and philosophy. And he did. And Bassem, who became a friend, published a book called Islamism and Islam with Yale University Press in 2012. And in Germany, he made this distinction between Islamism and Islam. And in return, he required 24-hour police protection for a couple of years.
Mm-hmm.
But that book, Bruckner and Tibi, those they're very important, and in terms of as they make a very cogent and plausible distinction between Islamism that emerged in the middle of the 20th century in the Muslim Brotherhood and the much larger religion of Islam, and that is. We need more frank discussion of those issues in this country.
So just returning to the domestic terrorism that we've now seen, directed at the Jews, I think Jewish Americans are sort of putting together, and it's unavoidable, inescapable for us to look at the firebombing of Governor Shapiro's home during Passover and the assassination of these two Israeli embassy employees, and now this firebombing attack in Boulder, and not to see that there is some kind of pattern that is emerging. Listeners to this program and readers of Mosaic will, of course, attend to the fact that the history of violence directed against Jews now has extended back many years. It's not just these three incidents, but these three do seem to emerge with new clarity and force and alarm. And we have no evidence that they're connected in any way. Nevertheless, the argument of your essay is that even without conscious coordination, we're likely to see an increase in these kind of events. The way that it worked in the 1960s, if that's to be any guide with the way that it might work this time around, will in fact they be coordinated, or will it just be lone actors inspired by, authorized by, stimulated by their predecessors who decide to take matters into their own hands and harm Jews?
I think both. And here now, I'm a historian of Europe and Germany, so we're talking about events here in the United States, and so you probably know more about this than I do, but my assumption is the following: that after October 6th, excuse me, October 7th, the appearance of encampments with the same kind of tents, with the
Mm-hmm.
same chants, with on many different campuses, very, very quickly suggested uh, a very impressive national organization and lots of money and lots of very, very skilled professional activists. So it wasn't just a coincidence that a bunch of sophomores or juniors at a bunch of different universities were chanting the same thing. There is a national organization and national movement, which proudly declares itself in public. So the and that is not going away. That is not going away. On the other hand, the internet makes it possible for Islamist organizations to pump out a huge amount of propaganda that various individuals can read in their bedrooms.
Mm-hmm.
Um, and the uh, the Rodriguez case, the alleged murderer. I mean, he basically admitted it, but let's just, for legal purposes, the alleged murderer Yaron Lashinsky and Sarah Milgram, uh, uh, was a student at the University of Illinois in Chicago that had a Students for Justice in Palestine chapter for a number of years, and so he would have been exposed to that climate of opinion. What needs to happen is this: that in order to push back on this ideologically justified terrorism, is that the young people who think that they're doing something progressive or making the world better by repeating the chants of Hamas should be told that what they are doing is supporting a fascist and reactionary phenomenon. Well, if you don't use the term fascist, a reactionary phenomenon. That it has nothing to do with making the world better at all. It makes the world worse. Israel lost the linguistic battle over the meaning of famous words like justice, like liberalism, like fairness, like all the, and so that is one of the striking features of the climate since October 7th is a really a reluctance to speak frankly about Hamas and what it really believes. And so young people should be asked, do you really believe that the Jews were the cause of the French Revolution? Do you think the Jews benefited financially from the Second World War?
Mm-hmm.
Do you think that the religion is
my worry with this line of thinking, Jeffrey, is that it's not enough.
Mhm.
And I am concerned that many of these people are so nihilistic that you want to say that support of Hamas is complicit, is makes you complicit with the support of these horrible anti-liberal forces. So they say, great, so fine, I'm supporting the anti-liberal forces. Who cares? The fact of the matter is that Israel is, as you say, born in sin and such the scourge of the earth and the embodiment of all evil and the stain that must be wiped away. That even if you have to break a few eggs, so you have that's what you need to do to wipe away this horrible stain of humanity. And that tying their actions and rhetorical support to these things that in an earlier generation would have been shameful, do not provoke or elicit the same kind of shame in the young, because they don't know and they don't care and they're historically illiterate and morally obtuse.
The worst thing for some of my colleagues to be called is a conservative. You could say they're, I don't know. That's the bottom line. And for the young people, the worst thing that they could be called is a reactionary or a racist.
Hmm.
And what you're describing are young people, and some not so young, to be frank, uh, who think that what they are doing is a part of either a liberal or a leftist project. Uh, that they are among the righteous in the world.
Hmm.
Um, and so that accounts for some of the phenomenon that you're describing. And my point is that uh, the that this misperception is the result of 50 years of ideological um, uh, currents um, of this linguistic magic I referred to earlier.
Hmm.
Israel was a result of anti-fascism. Israel was a result of an Enlightenment liberal project. It was a result, of course, of Jewish traditions but it was born in the spirit of opposition to racism and colonialism and imperialism. It was an anti-colonial, anti-imperialist, and anti-fascist generation
Hmm.
uh, of Ben Gurion and others. And the and young people and not so young people simply don't understand this. They and the PLO was a huge failure in many ways, but its propaganda success has been enduring.
Yeah.
To recast the meaning of the Zionist accomplishment as something terrible, it was wonderful. And
That,
and the and if well, so my response to what you said is that the in order to change the climate, it is uh, those people that you describe as saying I don't care. Said you don't care if you are really part of a phenomenon that is profoundly and deeply reactionary. You know, if you're a
you,
guy, do you not care that they would mistreat your girlfriend? If you're gay, do you not care that they would hang you and throw you off a building because you're gay? Do you not care about that? And do you really not care that on October 7th and 8th, these guys came into many people's homes and they murdered them with pleasure? You don't care? So the people need to be put on the moral defensive.
but you see here you see
What am I missing?
what I'm concerned about is that the defensive strategy that says I'm going to shame you into I'm going to shame you into changing your mind is precisely the strategy that the Nazis might have thought when they said we can't show the details because the details will produce moral outrage and opposition to us. But somehow the terrorists of Hamas have understood that if we show the details, it will elicit more support for us. That's some of the Berman insight is that somehow this moral horror will be greeted with welcome arms and will engender copycats. And my
Okay.
concern is that if that's right, then going and trying to shame the young people who are the true nihilists here, and you say everything that you think is black is actually white, and everything you think is white is actually black. It's everything is the other way around. I don't think that they care. In fact, it's precisely the mendacity that sort of excites them. It drafts them into service for something that seems very noble.
You you're channeling your inner Dostoevsky here.
Well,
So,
in a way, in a way, that kind of psychological insight, I fear helps us see something about the times that we live
yes,
in.
yes, yes. No, clearly when people take that leap, uh, there is a pleasure in the sadism,
So
and
let me ask the question like this, which is to end where you end your essay. You write that the criticism of terrorism and anti-Semitism must become louder, much, much louder.
Mhm.
Who could offer that criticism? What authorities in the West and the culture could could offer that kind of criticism where it would be heard and make a difference by the people that need to hear it? In other words, for you and I, we'd welcome that message from almost anybody. But we're not the ones that need to hear that. For the young women and men who are somehow seduced and 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 are sort of flirting on the line of transitioning from radical thought to radical deed, who
Mm.
could say such a thing that would make a difference?
Oh, that's, a good question. The I don't really know. I think um, this gets into the current political dilemma, uh, which we don't have time to go into in sufficient detail. Um, but it would help. it would help if there was someone other than Donald Trump who was leading this attack against anti-Semitism. I don't trust him in that regard.
Well,
I
in
think
in that,
I think all right. The editors of the Washington Post, the editors of the New York Times, of the
Mhm,
Atlantic, uh, the New Republic should recover its origins. Uh, the uh, uh, the uh, the leading Republican and Democratic senators, the leading Republican Democratic members of Congress,
mhm,
uh, the leaders of the Catholic Church and the Protestant churches, uh, the Americans should learn more about Muslim liberals like Boualem Sansal. Boualem Sansal is an Algerian writer who's now in prison. The Algerian government has thrown him in prison for his criticisms of Islamist totalitarianism and anti-Semitism.
mhm.
The Read Bassem Tibi. Uh, Pay attention to the Muslim liberals; they exist. Um, and the um, I'd like to, frankly, I think what you do, I think what I do makes a difference.
Well,
I'm not, we wouldn't be doing what we do if we thought that it made no difference. Um, the Because what we do, what intellectuals do, is to take vague and inchoate feelings and turn them into prose and paragraphs and books, and uh, that's what intellectuals. I know it's a pretentious term and people don't like to use it, but people who write, people who think, they take emotions and they clarify them.
mhm.
And I think that's an invaluable contribution. And I and you know I I'm a retired professor, but if you're a professor, you don't really ever quite retire. And and I always felt that my students did not want to be talked down to.
Mhm.
They wanted to be treated with respect. And if I asked them to read a couple hundred pages a week, or if I gave lectures that were demanding, if I wasn't trying to be their pal, if I was just being Professor Herf, they appreciated it
Mhm.
because they can see through phoniness in a second. They recognize efforts. So I would say um, that overwhelmingly young people do not want to be uh, cheering on terrorists, and that the uh, our conversation has gone on for a long time, but we live in an overwhelmingly Christian society, and and we need allies. There are very few of us. This fact about arithmetic is not mentioned often enough.
Mhm.
There are about 17 million Jews in the whole world. I would like some theologian or historian to explain why there are so few Jews. It wasn't just the Holocaust. Judaism is a marvelous
Yeah.
thing. Why are
Yeah.
there a billion Muslims and a billion Christians, but so few of us?
Yeah.
Is the Torah so terrible? Torah is a wonderful thing. The
Yeah.
prophets are a great thing. So we need allies, and we need them to speak up much more loudly and clearly.
And I think that there is something incumbent on us, American Jews, to be more overtly, manifestly grateful to the friends that we do have. Um, in the aftermath of these two horrible events over the past couple of weeks, it has been philo-Semitic Christians that have very plainly and courageously um, condemned what they've seen. The Jewish community ought to be grateful to them.
Yeah.
Um, and I think that that's just also part of being both strangers and neighbors here in America.
Yeah, I think the that's true. The secular intellectual world needs to speak up much, much more loudly and to look, because what Elias Rodriguez and Mohammed Sabri, and I don't know the name of the guy who torched the governor's mansion, I don't know his name. What they showed is that if you keep saying A over and over and over again, there's going to be somebody who's going to do B.
Mm-hmm.
You cannot keep saying A and say there'll be no consequences. You need to think about what you're saying, and there will be somebody out there who's going to pull the trigger.
I like to, on that note, I like to just underscore something you said about the vocation of the intellectual at a time such as this.
Mm-hmm.
Um, Sitting right now where we're sitting in June of 2025, it can seem as if pro-civilization, American patriot, Zionist intellectuals are speaking out into the ether. And yet, what more evidence could one hope for the role of intellectuals in history than the very fact that such highly credentialed academics on the other side have had the effect that they've had? It's just that they've been at it for the last, as you say, for the last 5 decades, and have very conscientiously made their arguments with patience and confidence. And we can hardly expect of ourselves to do any less.
Well, I think they thought for the last 50 or 60 years that they would make these arguments and that it would not have these consequences. That that there would be some kind of peaceful two-state solution, and that there would be mutual understanding, and that it was their responsibility to speak truth to power, and all the kind of things we've heard. But now we see that there are people in this country who take these arguments to the next step, and the and who understand the arguments. They don't
Mhm.
misunderstand them. They understand them. And so what we need are more Paul Bermans. We need people to read Albert Camus' The Rebel. We need people to understand that if you make these kind of ideological arguments over and over again, that they will have terrible consequences. And you must denounce the terror that comes out of it. That there is no justification for this. None. And if you want to defend our democracy rests on the principle of nonviolent public discussion about important issues.
Free Palestine, Free Palestine Terrorism was published in the Free Press on June 1st, 2025. Jeffrey Herf, thank you for joining us.
Thank you for having me. It's been a pleasure.